welcome to another episode of You Are Not a Frog. This is episode 52, A Year of the Frog. Now, we have been going with You Are Not a Frog now for just over a year, and this is our 52nd episode. I can't believe it. I can't believe how the podcast has been received. I've been genuinely blown away by the number of downloads, by the reactions from you guys, and from the feedback that I've been getting from people. For me, it's all about knowing that we are in this together. We can all draw comfort that we're in the same boat, and that we're not weak, we're not deficient if we sometimes struggle. And from the feedback I've got from people, it's just knowing that you're not alone and that it's normal to feel like this. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody who has been listening. I genuinely wouldn't be doing this without you guys. So thank you for sharing it with your friends, with your colleagues, with your family. Please keep sharing it. Keep telling people about it if you find it useful. And I'm aiming over the next year to bring you even more interesting content ideas from experts, from friends, from colleagues, so that everyone can take back control and thrive through these really difficult times. So thanks again, everyone, and on with the episode. Welcome to You Are Not a Frog, the podcast for GPs, doctors and other busy professionals in high-stress jobs. Even before the coronavirus crisis, many of us were feeling stressed and one crisis away from not coping. We felt like frogs in boiling water, overwhelmed and exhausted. But this has crept up on us slowly, so we hardly notice the extra long days becoming the norm. And let's face it, frogs generally only have two choices: stay and be boiled alive, or jump out of the pan and leave. But you are not a frog, and that's where this podcast comes in. You have many more options than you think you do. It is possible to be master of your own destiny and to craft your life so that you can thrive even in the most difficult of circumstances. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Morris, GP, turned executive coach and specialist in resilience at work. I work with doctors and other organisations all over the country to help professionals and their teams beat stress and take control of their work. I'll be talking to friends, colleagues and experts, all who have an interesting take on this, so that together we can take back control to survive and thrive in our work and lives. Now, through the coronavirus crisis, many of us have had to pivot and change what we're doing, both in the way that we serve our clients, our customers and our patients, but also in the way that we do things and the way that we organise ourselves. And I'm no different. So I have had to change the way I deliver my Shapes Toolkit training. And I'm really pleased to say we can now do this fully online in groups. So the Shapes Toolkit programme is a training course for resilience that helps people take control of their time, feel calmer, maximise their well-being and thrive in work and life. And we have just run the Shapes Toolkit training course for a training hub in London over 2 half days. And it was really great to have a load of GPs, practice managers, nurse practitioners and pharmacists, along with some other allied health professionals on the course. So if you are working for a training hub, running a health board or a CCG, an STP or a PCN, and you're looking for some training in resilience, productivity and wellbeing for your teams in primary care, then do get in touch with us. We know what it's like to feel overwhelmed by work and feel out of control. And the Shapes Toolkit will help people take control in all sorts of different areas. And the Shapes Toolkit isn't just for people in healthcare, it's also for other organisations in a high stress environment. So if you'd like to know more about that, then do get in touch with me. Now, coming up in October, I'm doing a webinar for practitioner health with Dr. Helen Garr, who's a wellbeing expert, and Dr. Caroline Walker, who is the Joyful Doctor. So we're going to be doing this webinar on the 20th of October, and it's all about how to rest during COVID, how to take time off and make the most of opportunities to recharge so that we can look after ourselves. The links to that webinar will be in the show notes. Okay, on with today's episode. Welcome to another episode of the You Are Not a Frog podcast, and this is our 52nd episode. I can't believe we've done 52, so we're just past our year anniversary because we had a month off in August, and I think we probably had a couple of weeks off at Christmas as well. But we thought that for our year anniversary, it might be good for you to hear a little bit about the podcast and why we started it and what we've been doing. It's So what I thought I'd do is get our very special favourite guest, Nik Kendrew, Dr. Nik Kendrew, back with us. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Rachel. That's very kind of you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, you've been on 3 times now, haven't you?
Yeah, well, it's always been lovely to come on. And I think you probably need to run a sweepstake as to how quickly it will be before I get all welled up about something. But hopefully that won't happen today because it's a bit different today.
So, Nick, what are we doing today?
So we are turning the tables. It's time for me to interview you all about You Are Not a Frog and everything else. So are you up for that?
I'm up for that. It's going to be weird answering questions rather than asking them, but let's try it.
Absolutely.
Let's go for it.
And I think, first of all, to say congratulations on your first year anniversary. That's very exciting.
Thank you.
And in fact, I was on the first episode, wasn't I?
It's been a year.
Yes, absolutely. So my good idea is for us to explain how we know each other. So do you want to take the baton on that?
Yeah, so well, we met through Red Whale, didn't we? So I present on the Lead Manage Thrive GP Update course, and Nick is a kosher, a proper GP update. You do the clinical stuff. You do the the hardcore stuff.
Well, yeah, exactly. And we often would meet at kind of social events, which would be things like the conference that we have every year, and we'd have a chat, and we'd always probably often we'd be doing stuff, and we get the train back together, and to end up talking for hours about all the books, the self-help books we've been reading, and we ended up sort of doing a few podcasts together, didn't we?
Yeah, so with it, the Ant and Decker podcast,
totally,
or the Judy and Richard.
Yes, maybe
the medical podcast. Yeah, maybe okay. Not
Philip and Holly. We can go for. How about that?
Oh, that.
I can live with that.
Yeah, me too.
So, why did you start You Are Not a Frog?
Oh. Looking back on it, I'm wondering, why did I start You Are Not a Frog? Well, I love podcasts and I love listening to stuff, and I'm someone who's always collected lots of ideas. I don't think I'm particularly original in any of the ideas I have, but I think of myself as a bit of a magpie. So I'll see that idea over there and think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that would apply to doctors, or think about a medical idea and think, well, how would that apply to lawyers? And so I wanted a forum to sort of collate all the ideas and things that I'd heard about and share them with other people. And I really like talking to interesting people with different ideas. So that was one reason. I just wanted to sort of share some of the stuff I was reading and some of the ideas I was hearing about and some of the interesting people I'd spoken to, because I'd have all these conversations when I was presenting at conferences or doing training. I think actually other people need to hear this. How can we get that out? So that was one reason. But also another reason was I just think that medicine can be quite a lonely job. And I think when you're a professional, in whatever profession you are, it's quite easy to work behind a closed door and to think that no one else feels like you do. And I wanted a forum in which people could really share the issues that they've had, because people really appreciate feeling like they're not in the same boat. And I hadn't really found a forum that did that. So I thought, well, I'll give it a go. I'll try it myself. And that's why I started it, really.
And so it was born, the podcast. And I think people have actually found that what you're actually saying, it can be very lonely being in GP. And often, if you're sat in your own office by yourself and your consultation room, the door's shut, you might not see anybody apart from your patients for the whole day. And so by listening in to other people's experience of that situation, I just think it's been really, really lovely to feel that you're not alone. And I think particularly in at least the last 6 months or so, I think, with things having changed on the planet, shall we say, I think it's been a really important touchstone for lots of people.
Yeah, I think, we've all got more into podcasts and more into, I guess, the self-helpy type stuff, and we've focused much more on our mental health. So, it's really nice to be in that space where we can share this important stuff. And because, doctors and lawyers and accountants are really busy people, they don't often have time to read loads and to digest everything, and so it's really nice to be able to give stuff in easy to digest chunks, and hopefully things that are slightly entertaining and easy to listen to. I think the podcast format is really nice for doing that, because it's much, particularly conversations and stuff, much easier to listen to than sort of someone monologuing on a webinar or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's lovely to listen to just two friends chatting, really, isn't it? So that's what I like about podcasts. So when it was launched, how was it received?
Well, initially I remember I was away on a summer. I was away on the Happy Startup summer camp. So great big shout out to Happy Startup guys, and they're a brilliant organisation which exists to help entrepreneurs and people who are running their own businesses. Put really purpose before profit. And so I was hearing about all these entrepreneurs and how they were doing things. And it was the weekend I launched my podcast. I just decided to put it out there, and I remember putting it out there, going live on it and thinking how many people are listening. And gradually, I think the first episode, on the first day I got sort of 20, 30 listens. I'm thinking, gosh, people are actually listening to this. And so, it gradually grew and grew, and people have received it really well. I think I was quite surprised about the feedback. That the main feedback I get from people is, thank you so much. It makes me feel that I'm not alone anymore. Rather than thank you for your deep wisdom, which would be nice, but no, I'll settle for it. It makes us not feel alone anymore.
Yeah.
And it's really good to hear that other people have felt like this and what I can do about it. So it's been received well, and the thing I like is being able to get people who are interesting. They don't need to be famous. They don't need to have written an amazing book. They just need to be people that have tried stuff and it's worked, and I think people really appreciate that.
Yeah. And how did it grow from those very first days? How did it sort of become bigger?
That's interesting. I don't really know. I think it's been word of mouth. I think that people have recommended it to people. It's obviously we put every episode out on Twitter, and I talk about it when I do my training courses and my Shapes Toolkit and things like that. So I think people have just heard about it, and really it's grown by people telling their mates to say, "Oi, listen to this, because there might be something in it that you find helpful."
And I think often what also happens is that the guests that you have on will tell their friends, and then they'll have a listen, and it kind of just gradually builds, doesn't it, like that?
Yeah, I think so. And so we've ended up getting loads of listens from people in all walks of life, which is really nice, because initially I thought, well, is it going to be just for doctors or just for people in healthcare? But I have lots of feedback from, say, practice managers who say, actually, I found it really helpful talking about teams. And then I know there's quite a few lawyers that listen and accountants that listen. And so I think, we're all human, right, aren't we? And actually, I think the issues that we face in healthcare are exactly the same as a lot of the issues we face just as professionals in high stress jobs. Of course, there are some very specific issues to healthcare, but actually people are people, and how we deal with people is just the same time and time again. That we keep returning to a few key core principles that we just end up talking about again and again and again. And they're principles that often I think everybody knows about now, because it's in quite wide circulation. Like, for example, the chimp. You're in a chimp, your amygdala response to stress. But I still come across people that I did a training for a GP trainers group about your amygdala response to stress, and I remember some feedback for some sort of guy who he'd been on hundreds of training days for trainers and stuff. He said, I've never heard this stuff about your chimp response before, and it's so helpful. So for me, that's that concept of your chimp response and getting out of your fight, flight or freeze threat detection zone is a really important principle. And then the one about staying in your zone of power, thinking about what you can control and what you can't control, again, hugely important. And I think those two are just principles came back and back, and whoever we're talking to, it always seems to relate back to this stress reaction that we have.
Exactly. And I think that my inner chimp is quite strong, particularly when I go shopping and I'm hungry. And I have in the past taken a picture of my shopping trolley because it's to kind of try and shame myself. And there was one time when literally I had a trolley full of chocolate and pizza, and I think there was some crisps and beer and stuff. And it's the kind of time when you really, that is your inner chimp completely taking over, when you're tired, when you're hungry, and that's exactly the point when you're going to bump into a patient in the aisles of the shopping trolley, and then you just kind of release the trolley and walk in the other direction. Don't seem to have a trolley with me. Come from?
Exactly. I've got the wrong trolley. Sorry.
Yes. Because you can't blame the inner chimp at that point, can you? Oh, it's the chimp that got those. So that's something I learned, that my inner chimp is very strong at times. But when you were talking just now, when you first started, did you perceive this as being for healthcare and then you evolved into something that involved more people, or was it something that you wanted from the outset?
I think I wanted it to be for both from the outset, because when I do my sort of resilience training courses, I train not just doctors and people in healthcare, but I also have been at other organisations such as law firms, publishing places, all sorts of different places, and people respond the same way to the message. So I envisaged it being for both. But I think for people in healthcare, it's very comforting to know that someone gets it, someone's been in the same position, someone knows what it's like to be running like an hour and a half behind on an afternoon surgery with lots of really cross patients through no fault of your own, because you've had like a child protection issue or something that's come. So I think for healthcare people, knowing that the people really get it makes them then maybe accept what you're saying a little bit more. But I've just been struck about the crossover between healthcare and these other sort of, I guess, knowledge-based industries, where what I've observed is that people get promoted because they're really good at the day job, like they're really good at operating, or they're really good at law or accountancy, but they've had no training in how to manage people. They've had no training in some of these concepts, and so they're promoted to a place where they're in a position of authority, responsibility, leadership, and they feel completely out of their depth. Now, I'm a big believer in the fact it's not that they can't do it, it's just they need to learn some of the skills to do it. And there's some quite basic stuff that you can learn, such as the chimp stuff, that will really, really make a difference and really, really help in jobs like that.
Exactly. And the people that, when they contact you, do they kind of say to you that, do they just say, I'm having a problem with X, Y, and Z? Or do they say, I work as a top executive and I'm stressed because of that? Or is it, so are you kind of giving generalized principles to those kind of people? Or is it much more specific to, I mean, I guess we've touched on it a little bit, but the kind of people that are listening to your podcasts, it sounds like it's a whole cross section.
Yeah, I think people listen to it for all sorts of reasons. So I don't think people say, right, I'm going to listen to your podcast because I'm stressed. They'll look at it and go, actually, that's a useful episode. And people, a lot of the feedback I get is, I was listening to Catherine Hickman's episode about habits changing, tiny habits and changing, and I'm going to do that. Or people will say, when we listen to Jane Dacre talking about, the gender pay gap, what she said about, are you going to be a full-time Skyver or part-time martyr? That has stayed with me. So it's just little bits, and it's really interesting because sometimes people say, in that episode, that when you said that, it really struck me, and I can't even remember saying it, or I can't remember a guest saying it, I can't even remember talking about it. So people take very different things, I think, depending on what they're experiencing at the time in their work. I mean, I think there were a few episodes that sort of universally grabbed people, particularly the episodes around conflict that Jane Gunn did were really, really well received. And there are a few things I think universally we do badly, and the first one is conflict and managing conflict, no matter how far up the pecking order we are, no matter how many people we're in charge of. Nobody likes conflict, and generally we don't do it very well. And so people were been really interested in listening to those ones, and those in particular I think have been very, very helpful.
And I think that probably goes hand in hand with, when you're talking about people that end up sort of being promoted and finding themselves in a position of leadership, things like conflict are not taught at all, and so those things are really important to have a resource to go to, and it feels like that you've been really, really helping with people like that when they feel completely out of their depth.
I think the thing with conflict is, and I do sessions around conflict, and they've changed since I've started sort of looking deeper into this. There are all sorts of sort of frameworks around conflict that we talk about and that you can learn, but at the bottom line is, we don't like conflict because we don't want to upset people. And why don't we want to upset people? Back to the inner chimp, because it flares up, it puts us into our fight, flight or freeze zone. It backs us into the corner because when we lived in caves, we don't like upsetting people because we'll be chucked out of the group and that would mean we die. So I think once you understand that our fear of conflict is all about our chimp response and our amygdala hijacking us, then you're starting from a place of understanding. And then you can think, okay, what frameworks can I choose to use that are going to stop me from being triggered, that's going to stop them from being triggered, and that's going to help the whole thing. So, I think all this stuff is so intricately linked and so important, really, that I think it's sort of just getting a bit of a broader understanding of all these different strategies, which is why I really like just having the variety of people on that I have, and everyone looking at things from a slightly different perspective.
So we've been talking about the different kinds of people that listen to the podcast, but when people contact you, what kind of things do they say they've actually doing when they're listening to you?
Well, most people are commuting to work, I think. So people say, I listen to it on my car, going to work or coming back from work. And I've had some lovely feedback. I can't wait for Tuesday when it comes out because I know I've got the new episode. And I think obviously during lockdown, people maybe weren't commuting so much. So on runs or walks or jogs or things like that. I mean, I love listening to podcasts, mainly on my bike, actually. I'll plug in for an hour and go off, making sure that I can obviously hear the traffic and all that.
Exactly. But, I often listen when I'm running, actually, and particularly if I manage to run, I've got a nice park near me. So when I run around the park, I don't get the traffic noise, so I can hear properly as well. So that's my preferred podcast time. So I have a killer question for you now. So tell me, what is your favorite episode so far?
Oh gosh, there have been so many that I have absolutely loved. I think one of my favorites was with Jane Dacre, who was an ex-president of the RCP, and she talked about the gender pay gap, just because I felt I was so ignorant about that, and she's just so articulate and so on it, and so doesn't take any crap from anyone. She's brilliant. So that was really helpful.
So how did you get her to come on?
Oh, how did I get her on? Because I was doing a talk at the Physicians Mums Group, Facebook group conference, which was an amazing conference up in Birmingham. She was speaking there as well. So I'm quite an opportunist. I'll run up to people and go, hey, can you come on my podcast? And she was lovely and said that she would. So that was brilliant. So I really enjoyed talking to her. I think, again, the episodes with Jane Gunn were really helpful to me and my listeners. I've been doing a lot of episodes with Caroline Walker, who's the Joyful Doctor. So we've been talking about how we support sort of frontline workers through the COVID crisis. And it's always a complete joy to chat with Caroline. And those episodes have been listened to an awful lot. And one of my, John had a chap called John Parkin, who's written a book called Bucket. So that was really good episode, and it's worth listening to if you can mind the language. And actually he talks about why using that language can be quite cathartic. There's actually a bit of evidence about it, but for me it goes a lot deeper. It's about sort of our attachment to outcomes, and if you can just say F it and do your best and then not be too attached to the outcome, that was quite a game changer for me. And he's just a lovely man. So those are some of my favorite ones. There's another one which I loved with Geeta Treforo-Seymour, and we were talking about treat others how they would like to be treated. We talked through the sort of social styles, 4 different colours type model about personalities. That was good fun. And gosh, there's been so many. I've done lots of Ask the Frogs with Jamie Wiley and some of my LMT presenters. I've done some with you as well, Nick, which have been really good. So yeah,
clearly they were your favourite. They weren't. That's what you were wanting to say. I mean, don't be embarrassed about saying it.
You know what? But you are in the top. Yours have got in the top 10. Listen, in fact, the one that's been listened to the most is one on COVID fatigue, with Caroline Walker, and then we've got something on conflict, and then actually one that was very popular was about how to act instead of stewing on your thoughts, which is all about acceptance and commitment therapy with Shani Langdon. So that was good as well. So it's been really nice to have a wide variety of guests. And I do try and make a mix between, people who've maybe written books or real experts in things, and actually people who are just there working on the front line, plugging away at it, a bit like you and me, Nick.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, I remember particularly one of Jamie Wiley's ones when he was talking about his very interesting pop filter for his microphone. I'll just touch my microphone there, which was made out of a pair of his wife's tights, which would work brilliantly. And I just remember him talking about squeaky bum time as well. So that's a very Jamie phrase.
Jamie comes up with the most amazing ways of describing things, which he doesn't always realise what he said until after he's come up with the phrase squeaky bum time.
So what, from all of this, tying it all together, what have you learned, do you think, yourself from doing all of this?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I've learned a lot about podcasting. I've learned that if you want to record a podcast, you have to kick your son off the Xbox because he takes up all the bandwidth.
Interesting.
I've learned to remember to record things, and I've learned quite a lot about tech and about the fact that if you haven't got good Wi-Fi, if you haven't got good internet, you're screwed. And I think about podcasting, you just need to get stuff out there regularly, and people will like it. I have learned about myself a lot, about, there are so many amazing people out there, and there's so much stuff out there. I've learned that what you need to do is take the ideas that are going to work for you, because not everything works for you. So you need to be very discerning about what you decide to try and what you don't, and not to beat yourself up if you're not doing everything that is suggested, because well-being and resilience could be a completely full-time job, but we've all got full-time jobs and other commitments as well. But the biggest thing I've learned is that actually people are interested in this sort of stuff. Sometimes in the world of training and well-being, people can be a bit turned off when you start talking about well-being, because it's seen as sort of a bit touchy-feely, or okay, it's well-being again. But actually, if you talk about the right things, people are really interested in it. So it's finding a way of making stuff accessible and helpful to people. But yeah, and I think, I'm just so grateful to all the guests that have been on, and all the amazing people that have been talking to me. Really, I think the main thing I've learned is how ignorant I am of all these amazing things that are out there.
I don't think you're ignorant at all, and I've always found it really easy to chat to you, and I think that's what's so how you get the best out of people, is that you make them relax, and you do get them to talk about stuff that maybe they would feel uncomfortable talking about, but they talk to you about this stuff, and then they realise that it's all gone out on a podcast. So. but it
I always say to people,
well,
we can edit whatever you want, and then they're really open, and we get to the end and I go, do you want to edit? And they go, maybe not. I think the one thing that helps people talk is when you're vulnerable yourself and you share your own worries and your own stuff. And I know that throughout my career and wherever I've worked, I've always tried to be really honest about what I struggle with, and the fact I'm really, really not perfect. And I have had people come to me years later and sort of say, oh, you know what, you really helped me because you just shared this story about when you'd screwed up here or when you'd mucked up there. And then I started thinking that actually maybe God had put me on this earth just to reassure people that everyone makes mistakes, just to share my mistakes so people wouldn't feel alone. And maybe that's what I'm doing with the podcast a little bit, is sharing all those times where I've mucked up, or the things I struggle with, so that other people aren't going to feel alone or worried about admitting it themselves or getting help.
Absolutely, and I find that when I share stories, when I've been teaching on sort of Red Well courses around the country at times, and I, as you know and you're aware, I do well up quite easily, and I remember being. So this, if you imagine, I taught in the same course a year apart, and one year we were talking about how if patients have had a knee replacement and you suspect they have an infection, then you need to send them straight to hospital that day to be seen by the on-call orthopaedic team for them to decide that they need to be treated and how that would what that would look like. And I told the story about one of my favourite patients from many years ago who had seen a few colleagues and they'd given her some antibiotics, and then I sent her in, and very sadly she never came home. And I remember getting choked up when I was teaching that, and it still gets me now. And that, when I shared that story and got all upset about it in front of the audience, and you feel a bit embarrassed, but you kind of think, well, if it's going to help one patient, one doctor to make that decision to send that patient in, then it's worth it. And then a year later, somebody came up to me, and a complete stranger, and he just said, I just wanted to give you some feedback. And I remember thinking, oh, what did I get wrong? And he said, I just want you to know that a few days after you told that story, I had a patient who had a knee replacement and had an infection. And in the past, I would have given them antibiotics and see how they got on. And I sent them in, and the consultant phoned me back and said it was the worst case I'd ever seen of an infected knee joint. And by sending them in, it actually saved them. And wow. And it just really took, and I had to, go and have a few minutes and just think, oh my goodness, wow, that's just something. And, to try and get my emotions back under control. But it was just, when you hear things like that, it is amazing, isn't it? that those things happen, and I'm welling up now.
That is fantastic. Are you welling up, Nick? Are you welling up in the podcast where you're interviewing?
It's not fair. Somebody send me some help. Oh, but you get the point that I'm trying to make.
Brilliant. That is brilliant. What's the sweet? We've got 26 minutes.
Not fair.
Oh, that's brilliant. But what an amazing story. I mean, that just makes it all worth it, doesn't it? All that preparation and the nerves about going on stage, and the when you're in a hotel late at night, you just got there in the pouring rain thinking, actually you hear a story like that, it's worth it. And I think some people have shared with me, was it you? One of my guests shared with me, they'd listened to the episode and said, that one of their partners had come up to them straight afterwards and said, it had helped them realise that they needed to take some time off. They'd gone off sick straight away.
Yeah, I mean that. I shared that with you when I think it was after the first episode, and you said, "Wow, that's amazing feedback," because it was a friend of mine who'd been seriously ill and was needing to take some time off, and they listened to what we talked about doctors being ill, and he messaged me back and just said, having listened to that, I now realise that I do need to have some proper time off, and he made sure he did. So that was really good.
Yeah. So if each episode is just helping one person to get the help they need and do what they need, then that's really important. Because I think that as professionals, as doctors, as other professionals, we are so bad at realizing what we need. And I think, there's an episode coming out with Caroline Walker really soon about, COVID and looking after ourselves for the long run. And we're talking about the fact that it's, if you were an athlete and you weren't looking after yourself, well, actually, they'd stop paying you, because they said, well, we're paying you to look after yourself. If you're a professional footballer, we're paying you to do it. You owe it to the fans who are watching the game and to your team. I think it's exactly the same. Whatever profession we're in, we owe it to our patients, to our customers, to our teams, to be looking after ourselves and keeping ourselves mentally fit. Because what is the tool that we know? A professional footballer uses their body. We use our brains. And if our brains aren't mentally fit and working properly, we're going to be making bad decisions and not making good choices. And I think we just neglect that. We think that we can work and it's going to be fine, and we can go at 100 miles an hour and it's going to be fine. But quite a lot of the time it's not fine.
Yeah, and I remember when I was first a partner back in 2006, and I think it was my first week or first couple of weeks, and I used to have a day off on a Thursday, and I remember, it was been quite a stressful time because it was a new job and all that kind of stuff. And I remember that Thursday that I had off, it was important to do lots of self-care. I think I went for a run, and I actually came home and I baked some bread, and what a dream of a day. And I remember saying, going in the next day and speaking to one of the new partners and just saying, it feels like it's actually my responsibility to make sure that I have the best time and the most kind of self-care time when I'm off, so that I'm at the top of my game when I come back to work. And she said that's really important, and it's great that you've realized that, because that's exactly what you need to do. And you need to be able to, this is a marathon, and it's not about the sprint at the end. You've got to keep going, and this is going on for years and years. So that's always been at the back of my mind, and that's why I think I sort of read lots of self-help books and try and do as best I can with self-care. But equally, you're absolutely right in what you say, that often it is a case of, I think I'll be okay, and things like sleep deprivation slip in, and it's all those things that then add up, and you get into that vicious downward spiral, and then they kind of all catch up on you.
I think the main problem is we think we're superhuman, and we think somehow the rules of nature don't apply to us, and they 100% do.
100%. So we won't talk about specifics, or we can if you want to. What would make a bad guest?
um, a bad guest is someone who's not interesting, who's very professional and doesn't really share anything of themselves. I think people like to hear stories. They like to hear a bit about the person's life. If people are just saying what they think they ought to say, the stuff that's PC, the stuff that that would make a bad guest. Someone who doesn't elaborate, or who assumes people already know the stuff. Because I think it's very easy to assume that people already have a bit of a background, or have read a lot about resilience, well-being, stress, and just understand the basic principles. But I always try not to assume that people have done that. And I think sometimes if you have a specialist who assumes a certain amount of knowledge, that can get a bit annoying.
Okay. And
sometimes. So yeah,
you can answer this with a yes or no. Have you ever had a bad guest?
I've had some guests that I haven't thought were great.
Okay.
But but actually, interestingly, there was someone, and I'm not going to say who it was, that I didn't think it was a very good episode, and actually they've had a lot of listens. So I think actually it sometimes depends on the topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to turn that on its head then, so initially, generically, what would be your ideal guest? Or who?
My ideal guest would be someone who has experienced stuff themselves and can tell a story. I think who has been working in the same way as everyone else been working, and has made some changes and got a good result. So they've lived it, they've lived the experience. I think that for me, authenticity always trumps sort of expert knowledge. It's quite nice to have someone who's done a lot of research and stuff, but actually if they've also done it because they've lived it, that is just fantastic. So I think people get sick of that. They want something that's real, and they want something that they can relate to.
And I think just to go a little bit further with that then, because you were saying earlier that you're an opportunist, and that you would quite happily go up to somebody and ask them to come on. So if there were no barriers at all, and you found yourself stood in front of your ideal guest, and you could ask them and they would come on, who would that be?
Oh, now you're asking. I would love to have a chap called Rob Bell on my podcast, who's my absolute guru. He does an amazing podcast called the Robcast. He's a really deep spiritual person, and that's my favorite podcast. So I'd love to have him on.
How are we going to make that happen?
I'd love to have Matthew's side. How are we going to make that happen? Hi Rob, please come on my podcast. He's a very, I'm sure he's a very busy man. He's in America. I'm not sure I'm his demographic. Anyway, yeah, Rob, if you're listening,
come on, Rob,
on the podcast. That'd be great. I'd love to have Matthew's side on. I think he's written some amazing stuff about resilience. But you know what? It doesn't have to be people that have written books or particularly famous. Some of my, the guests who I think have been most helpful have been people that have tried stuff and are, working in a day job and have got a few interesting things to say. I think that's just, yeah.
Okay.
People who I find interesting.
Brilliant. So have you got anything that you want to share with us about your future plans? Any little teasers at all?
Ooh, I think we're just going to do more of the same. What I would love to do is hear more from the listeners, because I think podcasting can be quite, and you'll find this out, Nick, because you're just about to launch your podcast, aren't you? Boggle Docs.
I am. Boggle Docs is launching imminently in the next week or so you can listen. Thanks for the plug. Yeah, so you can listen to that.
Sorry. Watch this space. We'll put the links in the show notes as well. So podcasting can be quite lonely because you're literally sitting in front of your computer recording and editing. So you're not always getting audience reaction when you're not getting massive amounts of feedbacks apart from emails that come. So, I would love to have a little bit more feedback. I'd love people to leave ratings and reviews, because that always helps sort of spread the word. And I'd love people to share it with their friends and colleagues as well, so it gets a little bit of a bigger reach. What I'd love to do in the future, I'd love to write a book. I'd love to write a You Are Not a Frog book. So any agents or publishers out there to get in contact, because there's so much wisdom that's been shared over the last year. It'd be brilliant to just be able to collate that. And I'd just love to be able to focus on what people really need, and we've tried to do that and be quite iterative over the coronavirus crisis. Had a load of podcasts recorded for what, and they were all going to go out in March and April, and I just couldn't, because everything had suddenly changed. So we suddenly pivoted, and most of those have they are coming out. But that's what's really nice about podcasts, is being able to change and to react what people need. But we need to know what people need. So as well as me guessing, it'd be really nice if people get in contact and say, actually, this is what I'd like to hear about. And by the way, I've got this person who'd be a really good guest. Or if you yourself have, I'm talking to the listeners now, have experienced something or want to talk about something, get in contact. I'd love to get more sort of listeners on and interview more people like that. So I think that's what's coming up, more of the same. And I think I'd also like to talk a little bit more about some of the Shapes Toolkit tools that I use in my sort of resilience productivity training that I do for doctors and other healthcare professionals and other people in high stress jobs, because these tools really, really help me in terms of staying resilient. And there's all sorts of things in there that's quite rich, and it can help you whether you're personally wanting to change what you're doing or whether you're leading a team. So I think there's a lot of people that listen to podcasts are also leading teams. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about leadership and management and how you support your teams for wellbeing, because it's becoming really tricky, particularly as we're all working in different ways. So I've got loads of ideas. The other thing I'm thinking of doing is doing a mini course about time poverty, because for me that's something that most of us suffer from. So I've got all these ideas. It's like which ones are going to come through and which ones are going to work and which ones aren't.
Exactly. It sounds like there's years of material in that. So all that remains for me to say is, Rachel, thank you for asking me to come and chat to you, and for coming to interview you on your first anniversary of You Are Not a Frog. And so congratulations, and I'll leave the final words to you.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Well, firstly, thank you for all your support that you've given the podcast, and we're definitely going to get you back with our self-help book group episodes. But I did just want to thank everybody who's been listening. Obviously, you hear people saying, oh, thank all my listeners and everybody, because I couldn't have done it without you. But genuinely, there wouldn't be a podcast if there was no listeners. And I really, really appreciate when people take time to listen and when they share it with their colleagues and their friends. So just a massive thank you from me. And I guess a brief request that, as like a little anniversary gift to me, if people could leave a review and a rating, that would really, really help the podcast get to other people, and people would hear about it. So that would be brilliant. And maybe just put this, I like listening to this podcast because, and just give a couple of reasons, and then I'd get the feedback. I'd love to hear from people in terms of emails. So rachel@wildmonday.co.uk. And so just thank you everyone, and onwards and upwards. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please share it with your friends and colleagues. Please subscribe to my You Are Not a Frog email list and subscribe to the podcast. And if you have enjoyed it, then please leave me a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. So keep well, everyone. You're doing a great job. You got this.